Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for our next webinar in this series that we're hosting, which is the Collaborative Intelligence series. We're going to be talking today about defining handoff points during the data exploration process. So we're going to be talking a lot about process. I'm going to be presenting based on a lot of industry work that I've done in this space. And today, if you're new to this series or new to these webinars that we host, we switched from going from an hour to 45 minutes. So we'll talk about that in just a second. We've got a couple of things to cover before we actually dive into the content. So first and foremost, the agenda. We're going to do some quick introductions about WIA and our sponsor for the series, Coginity. And then we'll dive into the presentation. I always encourage interactivity. If you've got questions, please post them. We'll totally get to the questions throughout the entire discussion. And then I will close things out with some closing remarks, how to find the recording for this webinar, in addition to some general announcements for women in analytics. So first and foremost, we host series every quarter. We host, the series includes 6 different webinars on similar topics. So each series has its own theme. The theme for the series that we're currently in is Collaborative Intelligence, which is, again, a free virtual series that covers practices, tools, and the mindset that unleashes a team's ability to discover, create, and share insights and information. We host these at the same time every other Wednesday. We've been doing it for the last 2 years, and we'll continue to do this on different topics. We've already covered, I believe, 4 or 5 different webinars in the series already. I think 4. This is the 4th one. So if you missed any of them, you can go to our community online. I'll post that in the chat so you can get to it easily. We do record them, as I mentioned, so you can access all of them there. And we will record the other ones as well. Or you can join our newsletter and get updates from us on registering for the other session. A little bit about women in analytics. If you are new to the organization, our mission is to increase visibility to women making an impact in the analytics space and provide a platform for women to lead the conversations around topics in this space. And that's super important to us. We do this through a lot of different mediums. One is the webinars here. 2, we have a book that we published called Analytics Interpreted that you can find on Amazon that has 40 different women authors. And then we also host a conference every year. We're starting to do them hybrid. We just did that this past year, but a lot of our attendees join us in person in Columbus, Ohio. Our last one was just a few months ago, and we're already planning for 2023, which I have an exciting announcement about towards the end of the webinar today. You can join our community. Like I said, I will post the community link in the chat. There's tons of activity, lots of conversations, tons of events, resource center, and a lot more on the platform. A couple of webinar tips. If you're having any issues, please send me a message, a chat. I'll try to help you. But you can also send an email to info@womeninanalytics.com and we'll try to help you there too. If you do look below, you'll see there's a chat and a Q&A. You can throw your questions in the Q&A. If you just have a general statement or announcement or something that you want to post in the chat, feel free to do that as well. And then with that, I'm going to pass things over to Catherine at Coginity, and she's going to tell you a little bit about Coginity and what they do.
Thanks, Rehgan. Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Matseko, and I work in sales and marketing operations here at Coginity. We're really excited to partner with Women in Analytics to bring you this collaborative intelligence webinar series, and especially for today's topic about facilitating the handoff between data team members during data exploration. So just to give you a little information about us, Coginity is a collaborative intelligence data workspace designed to remove friction points in data and analytics management so that data scientists, engineers, and analysts can work together as one. Coginity users love the seamless ability to create, discover, share, and reuse curated SQL business logic connected to their enterprise data, whether that's on-prem or in a cloud data platform. So whether you're a data scientist defining features for a machine learning model or a data analyst refining a query to answer a timely business question, we help you get the most value from your data collaboratively. You can visit www.coginity.co/WIA to learn more. And while you're there, download your free trial of Cogenity Pro, our SQL analysis tool designed to elevate your productivity. Just want to take a quick moment to thank you for your time, and I'll pass things back to Rehgan now.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I did post the link to Cogenity if you want to check that out and download the trial like she mentioned. So just head to the chat, you'll see the link there. It'll be easy for you to click. And of course, thank you so much to Cogenity for sponsoring this series. We are, of course, talking about collaboration today. So I am a big advocate for process and thinking about things from a process perspective. I will touch on a few tools today in terms of making it maybe more real for folks on the line. And we'll talk a little bit about how we can put some processes in place, things we need to think about, and how that will kind of manifest its way into what these collaboration points look like. So real quick, just want to make sure I'm sharing. Awesome. Okay. So I'm going to be talking a lot about defining these handoff points during exploration. This is one of the biggest things that I've done in my career when we start thinking about process design and making these capabilities really efficient for those individuals who do need to collaborate with each other. So if you are in this space and familiar with this space, you know that there are a ton of collaboration points throughout the entire process of building a solution and using data. And I want to highlight a lot of those today. And I want to talk about how you can make those interactions a lot more meaningful and a lot more efficient. We'll talk about some like high level concepts, but we'll also go into an example and talk about how to collaborate at the logical level. And that will look very different in the tools that you're using, depending on which tools you're using. But the concepts should still remain the same. So I will talk about them in a little bit of a generic sense so that they can be applicable to different people who have different experience with different tech stacks. The other thing I'll note is one of the biggest areas I've seen in terms of opportunity is truly defining the handoff points in terms of separation of duties is what they call it a lot, especially in like regulated industries, but also kind of that like roles and responsibilities that change between people. And one thing I've noticed in terms of roles and responsibilities is that it's so much easier to talk about it in terms of function than title. Because as we all know, titles are very different. They're assigned different roles and responsibilities depending on the organization that you are a part of. So I do mention titles a couple of times just because I think it's hard to avoid, but I like to ground a lot of these things in terms of function because smaller teams will have individuals on those teams that do multiple functions, whereas larger teams may separate those functions out to where one individual is solely focused on that function. So for example, if you're on a smaller team and you hire maybe your first or second data scientist, they're likely going to be doing a decent amount of data engineering tasks, maybe some analytics engineering tasks. They may be tasked with getting their model code into production systems, which would be more on the ML engineering side or ML ops side. And all of these are individual functions, but that role might be responsible for doing a lot of those functions. And so for smaller teams, the handoff points aren't as big of a friction point, but for larger teams, they start to become more full of friction because you do have these handoffs between the functions and the entire process. So I just wanted to provide some background as to how I'm thinking about it and how I'm going to frame it up in the conversation today. So I like to think about things in terms of context and why we're using it, why we're engaging with it. So when we think about context, I think about it in this like hierarchy. So we've got this raw data that's coming in from a system, it's coming in from a product, maybe it's coming in from an external source, like a vendor. And it's just raw, like we just get maybe it comes into like a flat file, or maybe it comes in through a CSV file, or maybe you're getting it from an API, but it comes into your system raw with maybe not a lot of context. Typically, the data at this point has, data dictionaries to provide some context around what the field is, what values are in the field, what those values in the field mean, type of, the data that's inside of that field, or the data type for that field. And then we have to try to make meaning from that. So we have to understand some of the logical components around the data being collected and create data models that add more context. So if we know that because the way that we capture data in this system might be inherently flawed because operations aren't perfect. We may filter out certain things, or we may join data against another system just to validate it. There's usually a lot of kind of post-collection transformation or cleansing that needs to happen on data. And it's really hard to do that if you don't understand how the system's collecting the data. So typically we do this by creating data models that are useful and meaningful for the organization, that is based on the logic around the data that's being collected and how it's intended to be used. And then we get to this point of metrics, which is a very strategic measurement of something that we want to use and track over time to meet some objective. And those metrics will have their own definitions. And typically at most organizations, you have kind of key metrics that you track. So on the sales side, you may be looking at customer acquisition cost, right? That's an important thing to understand. How much money does it take to acquire a new customer? And you may want to break that down by different channels you're investing in, so different departments are going to have different metrics that they're looking at. Some are pretty standard, some are unique to that company and how they run their operations. And so you'll take models, data models, and you'll be able to calculate metrics on top of that you can then use. And then the ultimate goal of all of this is insight, right? We want to have an insight about something, either something is up, down, maybe we need to investigate further, or we need to go take action on something. Typically the insight is try to figure out why and dig in a little bit deeper. If you're looking at something like a dashboard or a report, if you have something like a model, like a predictive model, you may be trying to drive action based off of the output of that model. So the typical case, easy case for this is marketing. We may predict that a person is highly likely to buy the product. So the action might be that we send them more marketing and invest in more marketing and exposing marketing to them to get them to actually convert and buy the product. So there's all of these different layers that people are engaging with in terms of interacting with data. And each of these kind of have their own handoff point, because think about the person who is in the position to actually make a decision based off of an insight versus the person who can understand the technical nuances of raw data and do something meaningful with that, right? Those are typically two different people, two different focuses. It's rare that you find somebody who's in all four of those categories, which is why we actually have to define what these handoff points look like. So I added the additional context here, right? At this point with data models, we are defining business rules. We are actually creating terms and defining what those terms mean. And you'll see an example later in this presentation about how we do that and why it's so nuanced and why collaboration is so hard because of that nuance. But we'll get into that in a second. Then, of course, as I mentioned, it's a measurement for a specific process. So I mentioned customer acquisition cost, right? That's a process. As a sales team, sales and marketing team, we have all of these activities that we do all the time, this process that we follow to actually get a customer acquired. And we are trying to measure very specific things about that process so that we can have insight into what's happening and make decisions on how to improve that process. And then, of course, the insight, which is to take action. So I want to talk a little bit about collaboration points at a technical level. I typically don't like putting a bunch of tools out there because I think that the process and the concepts are more important, but tools will actually help you to do that easier. And so I did put some up here just to kind of ground what I'm talking about into reality maybe a little bit more. So there's this whole concept around data ingestion, right? The ETL process or ELT process, where we're taking data from a system and moving it potentially or putting it into a centralized warehouse or data lake. And you can do that in a lot of different ways. There are out-of-the-box tools like Fivetran or Meltano. There are things like Airbyte that can help you orchestrate that. You can write, data pipelines in Python, which are super customized and potentially hard to maintain, but there's tons of options that you have to actually pull data in and run some quality checks against those pipelines. But this is really just to identify, like, to get access to the data that we need, that we're capturing in certain systems, and make sure that it's in a place where people can actually join it together and do something meaningful with it. So I'm going to focus less on the data ingestion side, because this is a little bit more straightforward and less painful in terms of the collaboration points typically. Where I see the issue usually happening is where the context starts meeting the data, which is around the data modeling. And I put orchestration on there essentially just to highlight the fact that you need something that actually runs the process that applies the logic to the data, right? So we can do things in like Python, where we're generating a data model in Python, and then we're deploying that through Airflow and getting that deployed so that it runs on a regular cadence. It's kind of a batch processing of data. There's other options that you can apply to this as well. You can use something like dbt, you can use SQL. It really just depends on what your stack is, but this is essentially that like super complex or potentially complex data model that the person who has what they call tribal knowledge understands all of the nuances of the systems that data is coming from. So they typically have a very deep level of technical expertise on, well, I know that we capture data in this way, here's what this means, and we have to filter this stuff out because it's, you know, not associated with the process that we're looking at, but it's included in the data. And this part is one of the hardest parts to get right in my experience, just trying to get the data modeled into something meaningful and useful for people. The reason that this is so important and the collaboration is so challenging is because if you take an analyst from a business unit and they need to use data that's collected with a process that they're unfamiliar with, they're going to have zero clue what filters to apply and what to how to transform that data into a way that's going to be accurately depict what they're trying to do. So this is extremely important, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in terms of getting data, massaging data into a usable format. And then of course it always matters too in terms of the context of the usage. So we may want to filter it out for this use case, but not filter it out for this use case, or we may want to incorporate a certain column for this use case, but not for this use case. And so you end up getting lots of different versions of similar models for different reasons, and that gets really challenging from a governance perspective to make sure is accurate and being used appropriately. And then we get to data usage, which is essentially taking things that have been modeled or views that have been modeled and doing something with it. So we're creating charts or reports or models, like statistical models, maybe in Jupyter or R Studio, and we're taking that and maybe building a predictive model off of it, or again, a metric that we want to track or some sort of KPI. And then the other two that I included in here that I won't spend a lot of time on, but it does help with the collaboration points, is the search and cataloging component, which is essentially contextualizing anything that you are building and providing a library of necessary information that people can reference when they are using that data view or that dashboard or that model. And so cataloging is really important, being able to search and understand what exists out there today so that you don't try to recreate something maybe in a slightly different way. These are core competencies around governance, for example. That it is super important to have, and it is part of the collaboration point, right? Because it's actually one of the most critical pieces of the collaboration points, what I call, like everybody calls curation, right? You're taking what you have and you're curating it. So, and it's a lot of overhead for organizations who are not used to doing things in that way. I did add quality monitoring down here, or observability, however you want to call this function. Observability is probably a more all-encompassing word, but there is a component of quality monitoring that does make those collaboration points much easier, especially when you're getting into troubleshooting. So it's one thing to actually develop something, it's another thing to test it, to deploy it, and then manage it over time and make sure that that thing that you built a year ago is still accurate, still applicable, still usable by the organization, because now you have to manage that. So I did put that in there because it does make collaboration points easier if you built 100 data models and it's being used by people all over the organization to make critical decisions. We want to make sure that those things continue to be accurate and continue to serve its purpose. And if it doesn't, then again, we have a collaboration point of making sure that we fix it, address it, try to figure out what happened. So the deep dive into kind of root cause analysis if there is a problem. So I bring up all of these things because there are lots of tools. These functions are pretty critical. I've not seen organizations move quickly without all of them. And in terms of being able to collaborate on things like SQL, you could use SQL in a bunch of different ways in terms of like the environment that you're interfacing with SQL through. And that becomes really challenging if you're not thinking about that across teams or within your team on how you and maybe another analyst are going to collaborate on a particular thing, like a model. So if you are working with another person on generating a model that includes data from two different domains, maybe you're really familiar with the finance data, they're very familiar with the product data, and now we have to create a model that includes both of them. Like maybe we're looking at like retention, user retention, which includes kind of finance information around churn and usability of the product. You know, that's a collaboration point that may come up because that use case is very valuable to the business, and you need to be able to work with that person on generating a unified data model for the two data sources or domains that maybe have not interacted previously. So you may have an analyst from finance who knows it very well, and you may have a data engineer from product who was part of helping design the API for the product. And now we need to try to blend those things together for a particular use case. And if you're querying this system over there and they're querying that system over there, and you don't have a centralized place to work, that can be a huge challenge. Mainly because you may I've heard this a million times in conversations, even in meetings, you get on a meeting and you say one word and you think it means one thing, and then the person on the meeting in the other department thinks it means another thing, and now you think you're talking about the same thing, but you're actually not, and that can cause so many issues down the line and create a lot of rework. So the better you can get at collaborating in a centralized location, or be able to understand the full context of what they're looking at, which can be kind of hard to do over a meeting, for example, the better. So these are the general collaboration points that we'll be talking about. I did want to dive deep into some different activities around these collaboration points as well. So on the left-hand side, I grabbed data usage, data modeling and orchestration, and data integration. I also kind of broke it down into these different phases. So development, quality assurance, metadata curation, and verification and accessibility. So a lot of us think about these three categories in just the lens of development, right? I'm going to write SQL query that will produce outputs that somebody wants to use. Maybe I create it into a view or another table that they can then use for analysis. That is typically what people think about when they're talking about any of these functions. So down in the ingestion side, this is pipeline creation and deployment. We're creating an ingestion pipeline, for this data source to bring it into a bigger warehouse potentially. Data modeling and orchestration, we're creating logic around the data to generate views of data that's contextualized. So I've kind of, I've gone over that point quite a bit. And then data usage, we're creating dashboards, we're creating statistical models, we're creating reports. But of course, just because we've created it doesn't mean it's right. And there's a lot of verification that has to happen around this process for it to be usable and trusted. And this takes a ton of discipline. So on the data ingestion side, is the data complete? Is it timely? Can we use it? How do I find that information if I am engaging with that data source without talking to the person who built the pipeline, for example? So if I'm looking at a data table, how do I know when the last time it was updated, like easily, right, as an analyst? And maybe I don't know the warehouse system that well, but how can I figure out that information so that it's at the tip of my fingers, right? The next piece here around data modeling, does the logic applied follow business rules appropriately? And again, this can get super nuanced. So you may think it does at a high level, but you may need to dig in and start to think about all of the edge cases. So what I typically like to do in terms of quality assurance around business logic is define all of my edge cases and start going through scenario testing. So if I've got this product from this category with this quantity, what output would I expect to see? And what output do I actually see? And these are kind of the fundamentals of testing, of course, but when you're talking to somebody who understands what it should be, they may not understand that concept of testing. And so walking them through the scenarios and showing them like, hey, the logic that I have built on this data model does in fact give you the output that you would expect, and really engaging with folks to get them to agree with that, understand that, trust that, so that when you're using it, promoting it, they're using it inside of their reports, they trust the outputs. So then the next question, or the next piece up here on quality assurance, is on the data usage side. So is this solution that we've developed appropriate for what we're trying to accomplish? So is the approach appropriate? Including, all right, we're just going to give you this metric with these filters. Is that appropriate for the use case? Do you want us to put more time into developing a story around the dashboard, or do you want to do some more deeper exploration on the data yourself? And so trying to understand from a quality assurance perspective, like the user experience of that solution. Is it accurate, and is the solution usable? And then on metadata curation, once we've developed it and collaborated on that with folks that we needed to talk to, and we've collaborated on the quality assurance side, we actually had somebody verify our logic, we had somebody verify our query, and we've tested it, pretty rigorously. Then comes the metadata curation, which is providing enough information and context for somebody who's interfacing with this thing without you there, making sure they have enough information to do their job. So they don't have to like fill in, a gap of information or a gap in context with assumptions, which is one of the worst things, right? So on the data ingestion side, we want to know, what does the data mean? Data dictionary, I mentioned that earlier. And where is it coming from? What system is it being collected from? Because there might be like duplication of data that comes from different systems, and maybe we trust one system more than the other system because that system's being used consistently and the other one isn't. So we want to know exactly where it came from, exactly what it means, and if we can trust it. I did just get a question too about whether or not you can put questions in the Q&A or come off mute. If you can just type them out in the Q&A, I'll read them out to everybody and then I can address them as soon as they come in. So feel free to throw your questions in there as I'm talking. And then finally on the verification and accessibility side, so data ingestion, we need to verify this by the operational owners. So we need to basically say like, hey, I pulled this data from this system. Does this look correct to you? Or, hey, think about Salesforce and how configurable Salesforce is. So you can create a field of any data type you want, and you can name it whatever you want, and you can put the values, if it's a dropdown, what you want, right? So it's highly configurable, meaning that the data that's being collected from that system may not be consistent because it might be customized to whatever's happening. So we need to verify from the operational owner that what the definitions of those things are, because we created them as an organization. And we need to be able to provide access to downstream users. So analytics engineers, analysts, data scientists, folks that are going to actually use it. The next step up on the data modeling and orchestration side, we need to verify this with the business or the technical data stewards, and we need to give access to analysts and BI developers. So like I said, sometimes it can be really challenging to verify logic, like nuanced logic, with people who might be more non-technical. We definitely don't need to explain why it's necessary to do that to them. However, we do need to be able to translate some of our questions into language that they're going to understand. So this is why the scenario testing is really important, is once they are responsible for saying, yes, I verify that that logic that you've explained to me is exactly what is the way that we think about it as an organization. Now, whether or not that logic equals the query that you wrote is a different thing, right? We need to have a technical person that can QA that as well. But at least we've said, this is the way that we think about it. You get buy-in from that person when they see solutions that they interface with, like reports or dashboards that include that information, they know exactly what is being referenced, right? They also need to help you create definitions around these things as well. So, for example, actually, I'll get into the example a little bit later. It's coming up soon, but you'll see what I mean by creating definitions around these things and kind of not forcing, but like really pushing the folks that own that operation to help you define those things. Because we can come up with definitions all day as technical folks that are, putting things together or putting queries together or logic together. But if it's not defined in a way that the business can understand and use it, then it doesn't ultimately matter. And then the top part here, verified by users. Again, we always want to sign off that the solution is useful. They get value out of it. They're going to make decisions off of it. And then we need to verify that on an ongoing basis and check in with them and make sure that what we've built is still usable. So I want to talk about the collaboration points that I just mentioned here. On the left-hand side, I highlighted what I typically call them. So at the bottom level, we're talking about logic review sessions. Again, this can be both technical and from the business side. Tools that I've used to help with this could be something like Lucidchart, where you generate kind of a pseudocode or a description of what it is that you're trying to get validation on, again, with the scenarios listed out on the side that you can use to create edge cases and ask questions about, hey, in this particular circumstance, how do you want us to handle this? And then one level up is the quality review session around metrics. And one level up from there would be solution design reviews, which again is like, what does this metric mean? How is it calculated? Why is it displayed that way? Things like that. On the right-hand side, it's who's typically involved in those conversations. So down towards the data model, the raw data models, you've got folks that might be called analytics engineers. This is a common phrase that folks are starting to use in the industry around people who are modeling data kind of post-warehouse. And then you also want those operational owners. They have to have a say. They have to give sign off. They know the process inside and out. They are responsible for running that process that data is associated with. And so you have to get those people involved. You may also have, if your organization is large enough, technical stewards. So those stewards are, again, responsible for ensuring things are curated appropriately and that they are consistently accurate. And if somebody does have a question about the data, they know who to talk to. So this person is well-versed in the systems that the data is collecting. They may also be well-versed in the operational context around how the system is collecting that data. But it is important to involve those different functions, as I mentioned before. And then the solution developer and operational owner on the metric side. The solution developer is going to be your data scientists, your BI developers. I like to generalize things like that, like at the solution level. I call it solution a lot, mainly because not everything needs a dashboard, not everything needs a model, not everything needs a report, right? So it depends on the use case. So I typically generalize it as solution, and then whoever's developing that solution. This is typically the interface of like data to action. So if it is a model, a statistical model or a predictive model that's getting like deployed into a system that automates a decision, then the developer of that might be a data scientist who's creating it. If it is an interactive Tableau dashboard, that might be your BI developer or analyst, however you want to name that individual. So this is just a kind of a generic a generic name for those types of developers. And then the operational owner, as I mentioned, needs to be involved in that one as well, because they are really the ones that are probably accountable for the output of that metric. So they probably care about how the metric is defined. And of course, you want to be very careful there to make sure that the metric that you're measuring is accurate, and it's not just kind of a vanity metric that will make an organization or part of an organization look good, but actually it will expose things that you can take action on. And then at the top, of course, stakeholders and solution developers to make sure that the solution is designed in a way that the end user will be able to use. Okay, moving on to requests and promotion. So I've talked a lot about like all the different areas of collaboration points, the different functions, what types of things that they're doing, what those collaboration points look like. Now I want to talk about how we engage from a communication perspective up and down these layers of context. So this is kind of an interesting concept in terms of like how much capability you have as an organization that is centralized versus decentralized, and how much self-service you have in place. So again, for smaller organizations, you may have a very small team that is responsible and has the ability to do a lot of these more technical functions. So it actually is a lot more streamlined, right? It might be more bottlenecked, but it'll be a lot more streamlined because the requests can funnel in. We can prioritize those requests, and then we can develop things, and then we can push them back up the verification process. At larger organizations, you may have something that seems similar to this, but it might be a little bit more decentralized. So you may have like full functions inside of a finance team, for example. But at the end of the day, as an organization, you need to decide what your level of quality is to promote the things back up, and then who is responsible and accountable for developing those things, and put a process in place for a team that is in the higher part of the context hierarchy to engage and ask and request for somebody lower down to develop something that's going to be useful for them. So for example, you may have seen, a lot of these like request forms that people will put together, right? So if I'm a stakeholder, I've got a question, I know I'm going to need data for it. I don't see anything out there that exists around this today. I'm going to put my request in. That request is going to be a question I want to answer. It's not going to necessarily give you the data. It's not going to necessarily be a data model that exists that can answer that question, right? So as that request comes in, it kind of cascades down. Like we may be in a position, if we've been, doing this for a while, that there's a data model that already exists out there, a metric that already exists out there. We just need to put it on a dashboard for that user, or give them, the access they need. And that's great if that's the case. But if you're just getting started out, you may have to build these layers of context kind of from scratch. So you will go, sometimes the request will trickle all the way down to ingesting a new data source. And if that's the case, the process to kind of move it back up this line into verification and promotion is going to take a lot longer. And this is what I like to tell stakeholders and try to explain it to them this way, that some requests won't take as long because we've worked with that data a lot, and some requests will take much longer because we don't have that in place. So if you're new to this whole process in terms of getting started, every request is going to take some time because you have to there's a validation point at each layer, right? And so I do think it's important, like I've found the organizations who can do this process of request and prioritization and then verification and promotion fast and efficiently tend to move a lot faster, right? They get answers quicker. There's a lot more trust in the organization because there's a formal verification process. So I just wanted to highlight that because that's kind of what we're talking about here when we're talking about collaboration points, especially between like even the technical folks down here at the bottom. The next one is not groundbreaking. If you're familiar with like general promotion or like CI/CD or testing concepts, that there are different environments based on the function of what you're actively doing. So for a development environment, and again, think about like SQL, like you're using SQL to create some sort of data model. We want to be able to have versions that we can reference that as we're collaborating, we know exactly what version we are sending to somebody that they're going to QA, because we may have like 17 different versions of the same query, things that we've changed slightly. Maybe we want to revert back because, that was exactly what we wanted to do, and then I misunderstood you when I was making that improvement. So version control, even in development environments, are really important to be able to kind of revert back or to reference a very specific set of code. And then lineage is also super important in the development process too, because you may be building a data model and that person is like, hey, which data set are you using? And that data might exist in like 6 different tables. And you can't just reference the data because they have no idea what table you're talking about. And this is where things start to get really confusing. And people may make an assumption, they're talking about the table that I usually use. If you're going to use that table, you need to do this. Right. So that's when that gets really confusing, is if you don't have that like clear view on lineage. And then the UAT is mainly around testing management. How are we recording that we took tests or we applied tests and they passed or failed? Quality criteria, how rigorously do we want to test this? Do we want to look at every single edge case? Do we want to cover 80% of them so we can move faster? What is our promotion criteria? Do we need to be able to show that we've checked all these boxes before it moves forward and it's usable? What are the boxes that need to be checked? Of course, lineage is important here as well, just verifying that everything is using what it should. And then curation, which is once it's passed everything and it's ready for promotion, have we rigorously defined everything so that it has context when it actually is being used? And this part gets left behind a ton. Nobody ever wants to do the documentation or the definitions, but it is critically important. And I throw it in here in UAT because it is the step that should happen before it goes live. And then of course in production, access management's huge, and then monitoring for quality. So as you can imagine, the more you have these elements defined, the easier the collaboration is. And I know we're running out of time, so I want to get to this example real quick. I do see a couple of questions. I'll take a look at those in just a second. So the example that I have here is, I'm starting to get insight. So why do we want to see it? What will we do with it? So this example is predicting inventory levels in the future to proactively order a specific quantity of needed products. I'm in charge of making sure that our inventory levels in our warehouse are where they need to be so that our shipping time to our customers isn't slow because they put an order in, we didn't have the product, and now we have to go source the product, right? So I may have some KPIs, ownership around that process. So the next piece is measurement. What do we want to measure? What do we want to see? So inventory is obviously important. We want to look at quantities per month for active products. Let's say that there's a concept called active products. And again, ambiguous term, but companies do this all the time. So for active products during that month, broken down by product type. All orders per month that came in from our customers and all the transaction details. What do they exactly order? When do they want it to be shipped? And all shipping details per order. So how long historically has it taken us to actually ship, these products to our customers? So there's a lot of words in here that of terms that you may think you know what they mean. A transaction, right? Or a product type or an active product. But I would highly challenge that every time unless it is rigorously defined. And you can point to the definition and everybody agrees when you point to that definition, that's what that means. So this is why the collaboration point is so important because of nuance. If I may define an active product as something that's being actively sold on our website during the time that it's ordered. Maybe that's my definition of active product. But that's going to matter because I may pull that data differently depending on the definition of it. So this is why these sessions of like getting into the details are so important. And then that's going to translate into some pseudocode that I can then use to verify that logic with my steward or operational owner or whoever, where I'm grabbing some Salesforce product field where I know that it is active if that field is true. Maybe there's an in inventory field that's true. And then I'm going to group by product. I'm going to group by month. I'm going to sum product quantity. There are elements that I can say like, hey, if this general thing is true inside of Salesforce, which you can point to the field and be like, see this field, when it's true, it's active. Do you all agree with that? Someone may say like, no, you also have to incorporate this part to make it active. And then that definition changes and my query changes, right? So this is an example, really, really simple example, but these are the types of collaboration points that we need to focus on. I did get a question about the collaboration point matrix. This tracks with what I see at the enterprise level, but can you help me understand collaboration points, how they change at firms with 1 to 2 week sprints or even teams focused on innovation and iterating daily? In these cases, ambiguity exists at each of the collaboration points listed in your matrix. Love to learn more on how you translate your matrix into environments that are very mature and can define out all the ambiguity before taking action. This is a really excellent question, actually. I agree with a lot of that. I think it depends on tolerance for quality control. I think in a lot of circumstances with highly regulated industries or enterprise organizations, some of the use cases that they're dealing with might be a lot more nuanced because they have legacy systems, or it might take a lot longer for them to dig in and understand and validate that logic. Whereas like maybe companies that are smaller or have a smaller team might not have to deal with a lot of that complexity. They might be able to just easily verify where the data is coming from, or maybe they've already documented that. I'd say like sprinkle in some of the rigor around that every time you are developing and get it into a routine where it is iterative. I think most of these things need to be iterative. So, it doesn't have to be this lengthy document, but getting definitions, like you're dealing with like whether or not your query code is correct, and if it's incorrect, you're dealing with trust issues potentially too. And so I'd say like, if you can make it a part of your development process and testing process, even if you are doing 1 to 2 week sprints, like some organizations I've seen that are smaller will do sprints that are deployed to like UAT environments. Like in 2 weeks, we've got a full thing deployed to UAT, but maybe not full production because there's some additional like iterations that we want to do on it before we productionize it. I think that makes sense. I think the sprint process for software development is a little bit easier when you can break it down into features, for example. But something that's like a holistic solution might be like there's no pared down version that you can deploy. It might just be it goes or it doesn't. And another way to do that is breaking down solutions into smaller chunks. So instead of producing and deploying an entire dashboard, can we scale it back to maybe just a couple of metrics or a couple of charts that we get out there, and we can keep adding to it over time too. So I think it really depends on scoping, how you scope it down in those 2 week sprint iterations. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but hopefully that did answer your question. I know we're a little bit over on time. I did cover a lot. If anybody has questions after the fact, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to talk about these topics. And of course, I've got a couple of announcements. The big one is our conference tickets. The early bird pricing ends today. They're $325 if you buy a ticket today. The full price is $550, and the conference is in July of next year. So if you're interested in joining us in person in Columbus for our Data Connect conference, be sure to head over to our website, dataconnectconf.com, and find a ticket there. Like I said, if you have any questions, reach out to us. Happy to answer them, or connect with me on LinkedIn. And everyone have a great rest of your day.